A new heterogeneous coalition is forming in Israel to replace Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has governed for 12 years. The coalition consists of secular parties, modern Orthodox politicians, Zionists, and members of a small Islamist party. Palestinians are not thrilled by the change, arguing that the new proposed leader, Naftali Bennett, would pursue the same right-wing agenda.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has called the coalition the, quote, greatest election fraud in the history of democracy. Journalist Zaid Jilani joins us now to discuss. Welcome back, Zaid.
Great to be here.
All right, so I think I come down on a different side of this issue than both you and Ryan, but let me just start by asking what you think response this coalition will get from typically pro-Netanyahu coalitions actually here in the United States. How do you think this plays in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think in Israel, a lot of people on the right feel betrayed because Netanyahu had built a strong right-wing coalition. And seeing some people from the far right kind of break off from that and deal with centrists and some center-left people was kind of interesting. I do think that in the United States, though, it won't make a huge difference because, remember, in the United States, we think about this differently. The people in the United States who are most kind of militantly, quote-unquote, pro-Israel, meaning supporting like the status quo, whether they be evangelicals or some in the American Jewish community, I think that they primarily are interested in maintaining military support for Israel, diplomatic support at the United Nations, particularly the Security Council. And I think they think that will continue to be the case under a new government. Within Israel itself, they have all kinds of domestic issues, right? Ranging from economic issues to religious issues and pluralism issues and cultural issues and so on and so forth. And that's kind of creating a lot of the divisions there that led to 5 elections now. I think in the United States, based on the interests of people here, whether it's Netanyahu in charge or Bennett in charge or Lapid in charge, doesn't really change a whole lot. I think they'll want to maintain an ironclad relationship with the United States and basically the same policy vis-a-vis Palestinians, Iran, foreign policy, so on and so forth.
Right, Zed, what will this new government mean on the ground for Israeli settlement policy and Israeli annexation policy?
Yeah, I don't think it'll change that much. I think that there were some on the right, and Netanyahu was pandering to them over the past year or two, that wanted to outright annex parts of the West Bank. I think that United States and Europeans kind of made clear they're not into that, and so I think they weren't super serious about actually doing that, but they're going to continue what they have been doing, which is more like a slow motion annex, right? Where they never declare that this is just their territory, but they keep expanding into it, right? They keep building more settlements, more checkpoints, grabbing more land, announcing the construction of more buildings. They'll never just declare a border and say that it's our land, because that would be annexation, and I think that would provoke somewhat of a response from the rest of the world. So I think they're fine continuing to do what they have been doing. It's notable that Bennett, who is expected to be the new prime minister, at least for the first couple of years, because this is an odd arrangement, right, where they're going to swap out PMs midway through. Bennett has been very vocal that he just doesn't agree with the Palestinian state. He doesn't think it's worth the trouble for Israel. Whereas Netanyahu at least had in the past suggested he would be open to it. His party was never really on board, and most people who watched this conflict didn't think he was super serious about it. But Bennett does have a more kind of open view that he's not supportive of it. Other people that are in this governing coalition, like Meretz, maybe are a little bit more supportive of a Palestinian state, but they're not going to have I think within Israel itself, the right basically casts all foreign policy debates, right? They have the leading role, and even if you have a minority left party in your coalition, I don't see them having much influence over the policy on this. So
we have a clip of a scuffle between a journalist and I believe Israeli security forces that I want to get you to react to, Zed. Yeah, you can see what's happening in the clip here. You can hear it as well.
Don't touch! Don't touch! I will not leave! Don't touch!
All right, so that's a pretty intense clash. Yeah, and if you see the journalist in the pressed vest, right?
Yeah, this is unfortunately, this is not an unusual circumstance.
That's what I was going to ask you. I mean, how is this reflective of what's playing out? What does this tell us about what's playing out, and how does it reflect what's playing out right now?
Yeah, I think where this happened is called Sheikh Jarrah. This is a neighborhood East Jerusalem, where there was a lot of controversy because there were people making claims basically that the Palestinians who live there don't really own the homes. Some of those claims would involve deeds going back to the Ottoman Empire, literally more than 100 years ago. But there are people making those claims, and that actually set off a lot of the recent violence because this was a very hot issue. I think that, unfortunately, what you're seeing here is how people in the press are often treated. In the foreign press, I think within those territories, I think, the Israelis have a sense, I think, that the foreign press is antagonistic towards them, right? I think during the past conflict, they had that same exact mentality. And I don't think that they think too much about how video clips like this look to the rest of the world, because in their mindset, the rest of the world already doesn't like them. So I don't think that they're starting from the presumption that they should try to be nice to Al Jazeera reporters, try to give them access to these kind of comfortable areas rather than just kind of arbitrarily arresting, which is a common or frequent thing with foreign press, particularly Arab press. So I think, this is the kind of thing where I feel like the only change that's really going to come is if friends of Israel, like the United States, like most of Europe, step in and start actually talking to them and convincing the Israeli government that some of this stuff isn't in their interests. I think within the actual Israeli body politic, it's a very, very nationalistic environment. It's completely unlike what you would see in the United States, even under the past 4 years under the Republicans. It's very, very different from the United States. And I just don't think that there's incentives within the Israeli political system right now to actually, back off, give the Palestinians some breathing room, give the press covering the plight of the Palestinians some breathing room, or do any of that until they actually hear some stern words from friends here in the U.S. who they trust. So,
how much does the Israeli right believe that world opinion matters anymore, other than the opinion of the United States?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Ryan, because I think Netanyahu, it always mattered to him. You could see videos from Netanyahu going back decades where he would be talking to Israelis, talking about how important it is to talk to the United States and how important it is to have them on our side. And there's even a video of him talking about how he thinks we're kind of easy to manipulate sometimes. But it mattered to him, right? He was someone who, I think he actually grew up in Philadelphia in the suburbs. He had a strong cultural connection to the United States, and a lot of Israelis do. But I think now we're starting to see a portion of the further right in Israel that maybe doesn't even really care that much about American public opinion. For instance, Bennett, who's slated to be the prime minister should the coalition take off, which it looks like it would, has talked about how Israel shouldn't accept U.S. military aid. It should try to become independent of U.S. military aid. And if that were to happen, then I think Israel would be on a course where it wouldn't really care that much about Western public opinion, particularly as they're trying to increase their ties to the Arab world, to the Gulf states, and to China, right? They'll have other places to get weapons, they'll have other places to trade with if the Europeans eventually put sanctions on Israel or something. And that's a more dangerous situation. It would have been better if under the past 4 years under Trump or past 8 years under Obama, they had leaned on Netanyahu more, because I think Netanyahu, as right-wing as he is, still had a pragmatic streak to him. I think that the rising far right in Israel is very, very obstinate and very, very nationalistic. And they may even decide that they'll go their own way no matter what the rest of the world thinks, which I don't think traditionally under Labor or Likud was the case. I do think they cared a lot about U.S. public opinion under those governments.
Well, and the clip that we just talked about is kind of reflective of how complicated this entire situation is to observers here in the United States, because Al Jazeera in these territories is not, the same as the New York Times in the United States of America. It's a very sort of different situation, and there's no defense for attacking journalists under any circumstance whatsoever. I'm curious as to what you think, Zed, we can expect to see in the next week, just the next week. What do you think? How do you think this plays out? Because things are so fluid and they're changing so quickly. What do you expect to see in coming days?
Yeah, I did see that the Israeli police denied permits for basically a far-right march. It was like a flag march through this district in Jerusalem, which I think that's reflective of the fact that Netanyahu was trying really hard to form a government over the past really several years, but certainly over the past few weeks. And I think that the security officials within Israel tend to be much more pragmatic than the politicians, because they don't have to face elections. They really are just concerned about flare-ups, and they don't want to cause violence if it's unnecessary. And so I think the security officials are starting to adjust with the fact that maybe Israel's not going to have another election, right? So you may see people like the Shin Bet, which is their version of the FBI sort of, or the police or the military, start stepping in and saying, hey, look, we got to stop some of this provocative action. We can't just keep having an iron fist with these people or appeasing the far right. And, that may help things, I think, in the short run. Over the next week or so, we may see the kind of decline of Netanyahu and the fact there won't be another election anytime soon mean that the security officials get a little bit more political leeway, I think, to kind of push back on the far right a little bit and maybe help settle things on the ground in Jerusalem. I mean, I think that's the hope of a lot of people anyway.
Well, Zaid Jilani, thank you so much for joining us on Rising.
Thanks.
And we'll have more Rising for you after this.